Welcome everyone to the Eastside Freedom Library. My name is Clarence White. I'm the Associate Director here at the Eastside Freedom Library, and we are happy to welcome Carolyn Holbrook for this book talk, talking about her new collection of essays, Tell Me Your Name and I Will Testify. It has been said of the book that it is a memoir and essay in which Carolyn Holbrook summons untold stories stifled by pain or prejudice or ignorance, and ultimately demonstrates how creative writing can be a powerful tool in challenging racism. Today, she is joined by three other people in our community. Naja Davis, who is a senior at De La Salle High School, who enjoys making fun memories with her friends and her lovely family. She also finds time to discuss social issues that affect certain groups in America. She believes that any change begins with conversation. We also have Zenzele Isoke, who is a Black feminist theorist, urban ethnographer, and political storyteller. Mother of two Black women, Zenzele designs and teaches university courses that integrate mindfulness and mindfulness of body and breath techniques with Black feminists through thought to teach about race, gender, empire, and for undergraduate students. She is the author of Urban Black Women and the Politics of Resistance. And Zenzele also leads a BIPOC meditation at the yoga room in North Minneapolis. And finally, we're joined by Marquita Stevens, who is the Director of Education Programming and Policy for the Urban League in the Twin Cities, and is the principal at Marquee Coaching and Consulting. She is an active member in the community, most notably Black Women Rising, Executive Leadership, and the League of Women Voters, Roseville. And she also enjoys swimming and is an avid moviegoer. Carolyn Holbrook is one of the mainstays of sort of the literary scene and also the literary development scene here in the Twin Cities, who has established several programs that are really foundational for many of us here who are writers, especially women and writers of color and people from other marginalized communities. She is the director of More Than a Single Story. She also started Sassy the Right Place many years ago, and some of those stories are collected here in this memoir. I want to mention that this book, Tell Me Your Names and I Will Testify, is a finalist for the 2001 Minnesota Book Award. So congratulations for that. And she is also the co-author of Dr. Josie Johnson's memoir, Hope in the Struggle, along with Arleta Little. And her essays have been published widely, most recently in A Good Time for the Truth, Race in Minnesota, and Blues Vision, African-American Writing from Minnesota. She is the first person of color to win the Kay Sexton Award for contributions to the Minnesota literature from the Minnesota Book Awards and the Friends of the St. Paul Public Libraries. I think I have said enough, and I would love to hear what our four presenters are going to share with us. This promises to be a really great event. And with that, I am going to hand it over to our guest of honor, Carolyn Holbrook. Thank you.
Thank you, Clarence, and thank you, Paul, and Peter and Carla, ESFL staff, for having us here. I am so happy to have this conversation today with my two friends and my granddaughter, Naja. Intergenerational conversations are really important to me, so I often include a young person in my public presentations. My book is a memoir, but it's structured as a series of standalone essays And this is largely because the essays were written over a lengthy period of time, beginning in the 80s when my 5 children were in their teens. Some have been published previously in other publications, and part of putting the book together was for my editor, Eric Anderson, and I to consider which ones would work together in this collection. The essays in the book discuss a variety of themes: life as a divorced single mother, my career as a literary arts administrator and building my career while raising my children alone, my struggles with depression, and my struggles with the racism that's hidden under Minnesota Nice. Many people have asked about the title. The book begins with an epigraph, a section of a poem by the great Lucille Clifton, which Marquita is going to read later. And then I move into prologue, where I tell the story of a visit from an ancestor who commands me to tell our story. I took that to mean my family's story, but it could also mean that I should testify on behalf of myself, my ancestors, my children, and perhaps on certain aspects of the story of my people. So in a recent discussion that I had with my 3 conversation partners, 2 of the essays came up that we're going to share with you today. One is called The Bank Robbery, and then we're also going to share a brief section from one that's titled Tanya's Birthday. So The Bank Robbery is the story of, my oldest son, who I refer to as my number 1 son because he's my oldest, was incarcerated in the federal penitentiary for 10 years for robbing a bank. And shortly after he was sent to the prison, he called and he asked me why his life turned out the way that it did. And I asked if he'd be willing to write letters back and forth about a variety of topics in order for us to try to figure that out together. Then after several years of writing these letters, I began to feel like the correspondence could become an essay, and he agreed. And writing this piece together, excuse me, has had a healing effect on both of us. My son Stevie still has some problems, but he never went back to prison. He's been out for, maybe about 15 years, maybe not quite that long. I can't keep track of time. And he was able to vote in the 2016 election for the very first time in his life, not for Trump, thank you. So because this essay is written in 2 voices, my voice and my son's voice, Zenzele and I are going to read it together. She will read Stevie's sections. Okay, are you ready? Okay. So this begins on page 111 in the book. And I start most of the essays in the book with an epigraph. And this one is a quote by Brian Stevenson, founder of the Equal Justice Initiative. Each of us is more than the worst thing we've ever done. On November 10th, 2002, my eldest son was sentenced to 10 years in the federal penitentiary. 10 years, hard time, and maximum security. This wasn't the first time Stevie was given a number to replace his name. He has spent most of his life behind bars, a short sentence here, a longer one there, but this time it was serious. This time, my number 1 son robbed a bank in a lily-white suburb of St. Paul, Minnesota, a blue-collar burb with a shamrock as its logo, a 36-mile area 15 miles south of the Twin Cities, whose census data in the year 2000 reported a population of 14,619 white people, with a smattering of Asians and Latinos and 1 or 2 Black folks for diversity. It's a community with a median income of $65,000, derived primarily from heavy industry, refineries, industrial waste plants, and the like. Excuse me. A few years earlier, Stevie was feeling frustrated. Mom, he complained, nobody wants to give an ex-offender a decent job or rent him a decent apartment, especially if he's a felon. But my number 1 son has held on tight, and to his surprise and my great pride, some good things started to happen for him. A series of firsts. He worked his way off parole for the first time since he was a teenager. He landed a job driving a semi, the job he had dreamed of ever since I brought him his first set of Hot Wheels when he was barely old enough to walk. The kind of job that allowed him to feel powerful as he guided a mighty rig across the highways of the US of A, praising God for the beauty of the plains, the hills and mountains, the rivers and the oceans that he witnessed along the way. For the first time in his life, my number one son had the means to buy a brand new car, and for the first time, he was blessed with a child of his own. But one morning when Stevie showed up for work, ready to hit the road, he was faced with the shocking news that the company had closed its doors, leaving all of its workers jobless and leaving him vulnerable, in danger of reverting back to his old patterns. Excuse me. Ex-offender, convicted felon seeks employment. Baby mama screaming on him because the rent's late and the baby needs shoes. Powerless. Ashamed to tell the shrink that he didn't have the money for the meds that kept his bipolar disorder in check. Powerless. Ashamed to tell his Narcotics Anonymous sponsor, or anyone else for that matter, including the Almighty, to ask for help. Shame has amazing power. It can cause a person to turn something around so that it begins to look like what happened was your fault, like Stevie was to blame for the company's problems. Shame. Shame buried just beneath the epidermis, the top layer of his skin, ready to jump out and bite him in the ass at a moment's notice. Shame stored in his genetic memory, embedded in his DNA. Shame that started when his great-great-grandparents were shackled and forced to walk through the door of no return, locked up on ships that carried them through the Middle Passage, shitting and puking all over themselves and their relatives, friends, and neighbors, chained close together like they were in a can of sardines, then stripped of their history, their identity, their language, their religion. Shame passed down to him through 3 or 4 generations of family members who suffered the pain and humiliation that started with slavery and mutated into a deep anger and self-hatred, one of the far-reaching effects of the phenomenon that Dr. Joy DeGruy has coined post-traumatic slave syndrome. It's the kind of shame that has no place to go, except to be visited upon those less powerful, like spouses and children. My mama praised me for having put an end to the child abuse that's been in our family for all these generations. But by the time I learned how to show my children that I love them, it was too late for Stevie. Shame, shame, shame on you. It took only a few weeks for the positive energy Stevie had built up over a few short years of living productively to dissipate. He began to spiral out of control, sinking into that familiar black hole of drugs and alcohol. And on November 20th, 2001, 2 months and 9 days after the attacks on the World Trade Center, a year and 10 days before he was sentenced to the federal penitentiary, my number one son imploded.
Dear Mom, Donna threw me out and I was living in my truck, so I decided to head out to Denver. I liked it when I lived there before, but it wasn't the same this time. I got with this beautiful hooker named Celeste and got stranded when she stole my SUV. I tracked down the guy who hooked me up with her and pressed him to tell me where she was. He took me to her place and I met her grandfather. I told him she stole my truck and he got upset, frustrated with his granddaughter, saying, "I don't know why she keeps doing this to me." The old man, Calvin, let me stay there for about a week until the police found my truck in the impound lot. I didn't even recognize the signs that said I was once again reaching the bottom of my life, which is always the stop before prison. I had no money at all, so I called my little bro and he sent me enough to get my car out and get back home. I promised to give him the money as soon as I got back to Minnesota. In fact, I asked him to pick up my unemployment check and hold it until I got back, which he did. I called him when I was about 6 hours away and told him that I would be there around 3 or 4 in the morning. He stashed my check on his front porch so I could pick it up without disturbing his family. I blazed into town around 4 a.m., stopped off at my brother's and picked up my check from the hiding place on his porch, hit the freeway and headed to the check cashing place on Lake and First Avenue. It should have taken me about a half hour to get from his place in the burbs, but at that time in the morning, when there isn't much traffic, it only took half the time. My plan was to cash a check and run back out to Julian's crib to give him the money I owed him, but I ended up at the crack house instead. My custom has always been to get my dope and then look for a woman, not necessarily for the sex. It was more about the company. I found this pretty, petite little Chicana, and for the next day and a half, we went bar hopping, went back and forth to the crack house, and holed up in a motel in South Minneapolis. I didn't know what it was about this girl that made me want to keep her. With street women, time's up when the money runs out. So I was trying to use whatever brain cells I hadn't smoked up to figure out how to keep her from leaving. When we couldn't stay at the motel any longer, I pulled into a liquor store and stole a bottle of vodka. We polished off the vodka in a matter of minutes, and right about this time, the edge was coming off the dope. I asked her if she'd ever robbed a bank. She said no, but she knew of a way to rob banks by computer. I wasn't really trying to hear that because I was one of those here and now type niggas. I didn't have the patience for all that long-term hustling. It was Tuesday, right around noon, and we were getting hungry. I pulled into the Burger King knowing that all I had were some bad checks from my account that had been closed. So I went inside where I could write a check instead of trying to order something at the drive-up window. When I came back out, the girl was gone. I guess all that talk about robbing banks scared her. But by now, I had been talking so much about robbing a bank that I convinced myself to do it. So I pulled into a convenience store and stole a pair of those dark mirrored sunglasses so no one could tell what I was looking at. And then it was off to the bank. The first bank I went to was crowded, so I left, jumped back into my truck, and just sat there in the parking lot for about 20 minutes. And I sat there. I saw where I was heading, back to prison. I thought about all that I had lost in just a matter of 30 days, a good job that I love, my woman, and my little baby girl. I began to feel tears well up, but Mom, not cry. Not one tear fell from my eye. It was almost like those bitter tears were backing up into my soul. I was in Apple Valley, not far from Hastings, where there's a detox center. So I thought, I better get to detox. That's the only thing I could do at this point. I pulled myself together, started up the Bravada, and headed off with full intentions of getting off the freeway in Hastings and dropping at the detox center. But as I was rolling through Rosemount, I caught a glimpse of a sign that said, TCF Bank, grand opening. Very impulsively, I pulled into the parking lot at Cub Foods Market with the TCF Bank attached to it. I circled the building and found a place to park. Then I wrote a note demanding money. I put on my shades and my baseball cap, which read, Female Body Inspector, FBI, how ironic, and went into the bank and scoped it out. One of the tellers stood out. She was so beautiful. I walked in, half mesmerized by the beauty of her caramel colored skin, her long, thick black hair, and her honey colored eyes, and half desperate for the money. I talked with her briefly, and she told me that she was Persian. Then I slid her the note. I should have slid her my number instead and asked her for a date. She looked at the note, then looked at me like she was confused, like she couldn't believe what was happening. And then she nodded her head in agreement. When she opened the money drawer and began pulling out the cash, I noticed a slot in the drawer that was stacked with $100 bills. Little did I know that slot had the device that would change the next 10 years of my life.
The Rosemount newspaper reported that Stevie used a threatening note and the suggestion of a gun to walk out with the undisclosed amount of money. Witnesses helped identify him. As he ran out of the bank, he had shoved the money down his pants, and a dye pack exploded, which attracted the attention of a number of people. One wrote down his license number. I imagine Stevie dropping the bank of loot down the front of his pants and trying to walk fast to the Oldsmobile Bravada, the SUV he had purchased brand new just a few months before when he was employed. I see him looking over his shoulder because he knows that a Black man stepping into a new car in small town Minnesota will raise some eyebrows. I hear the dye pack explode, pow, and I see this red substance cover the front of his pants as he climbs into the truck. Listen, do you hear the crowd? Can you see people spilling out of the building? Do you hear them yelling, catch him, don't let him get away, give me a piece of paper, gotta get his license number. And I see my number one son peel out of the parking lot, out of his mind from the pain in his groin and the crack cocaine that gave him the guts to stop off in Whitetown and rob the bank, his dark eyes shining with a mixture of sadness, wonder, and surprise, glazed and sparkling. I imagine him taking his right hand off the steering wheel and reaching down to unfasten the holster where his cell phone is locked, lifting the phone and dialing somebody's number, then parting the mustached lips that hide his perfect teeth. But before he can get the first word out, the dye pack starts to burn in his crotch, making the insides of his bones scream. He muffles the screams, recalling instead the confusion on the bank teller's face when she realized that the glassy-eyed Black man who stood on the other side of the bulletproof glass, the ginger-skinned desperado dressed in dark glasses, a baseball cap, tight jeans, and a brown leather jacket, stinking to the high heavens because he had been up smoking crack and drinking whiskey for 3 days and 3 nights, I slipped her a note commanding her to fork over the cash. But he can't hold the screams back for long. He has to keep moving before the cops catch up with him. But where will he go? He has to get that bag of hot money out of his pants before the substance ruins his ability to father another child. He's trying to keep control of his ride while his crotch is burning so hard that he wonders if he has finally made it to that place where it's rumored that Satan makes his home. I imagine him digging his sweaty hands down where the sun doesn't shine and coaxing the offending bag of cash away from his parched skin, a long guttural moan barely making it past the Adam's apple on his thick brown neck. And I imagine Julian, my younger son, who has a happy, prosperous life with his wife and 3 children, feeling hurt, bewildered, and disappointed, wondering why his big brother ripped him off.
I put the bundle of money on the passenger seat, and when I picked it up again, it was still smoldering. Traces of the red dye had burned through the tan leather seats. I attempted to see what I could salvage from the bundle. Now picture this, Mom. Here I am, blazing down a dirt road with my pants and underwear down around my ankles, kicking up a thick cloud of dust behind me and tossing all of the destroyed, banded bundles of money that I couldn't salvage out the window. Then it was off to Rochester, where I had a delicious steak dinner and left the waitress a $20 tip. I hooked up with my dope man when I got back into town. It was a Tuesday before Thanksgiving, and I had promised him a month before that I would take him home to Detroit to see his mom for Thanksgiving. You know me, Mom. How could I refuse a request like that? He was just a 20-year-old kid. He called me Unc, and I called him nephew. I spent $400 with him, then holed up in a hotel room close to his house, smoking crack and tweaking so we could hit the road on Wednesday. I was still on fire from the burn I got from the dye pack, so I showed it to the kid on the way to Detroit. He asked me what had happened. He grimaced and then told me that I needed to put some peroxide, Neosporin cream on it, so we stopped and got some. Sure started feeling better. Soon as the youngster and I hit Wisconsin, my cell phone rang. I knew it was Donna. She asked where I was, and I told her I was on my way to Detroit for Thanksgiving. She asked me to come back and spend it with her and the kids, but all I could think of was, you got some nerve. You threw me out the house. I've been sleeping in my truck and you didn't care when I was stranded in Denver for 5 days. And now you want me to have Thanksgiving with you? I talked with her again while I was in Detroit. Told her I'd be back at 6 on Saturday morning. I remember telling her that I was on my way to greatness, whatever that meant, and she started crying. It didn't dawn on me until later what her tears were about. Anyway, we started back to Minneapolis on Friday night. The youngster was tired from the whipping and running we were doing, so I took the first leg of the trip. Mom, I know you're familiar with divine intervention. Well, I believe that's what happened for the rest of the trip. God was not willing to let me go through with my plans for the next 24 hours. I drove for about 4 hours, and right after 6 a.m., as we were pressing through Gary, Indiana, and were about to head into Illinois, I got so groggy that I had no fight left in me, no energy. I turned the wheel over to the youngster and was about to nod off to sleep when Donna called again and asked where I was. I laid my seat back and went to sleep just as we were about to cross the Illinois-Wisconsin border. About 4 hours later, the youngster woke me up in a panic. "Unc, he cried out. "We're getting pulled over." Being a trucker, I knew how the troopers were in Wisconsin, so I said, "Boy, I told you not to speed in Wisconsin." He assured me that he had set the cruise control at 60 miles per hour. So I told him to pull over and we straightened out the whole thing. But he said, "I don't think you understand. We are getting pulled over." I flipped down the visor and opened the mirror. When I looked out the windshield, what I saw was like something you only see in movies. I swear, Mom, Wisconsin state troopers and federal marshals were everywhere. They had completely shut the highway down. You would have thought I was Osama bin Laden the way they came at me. A few days later, as the marshals were transporting me to the federal jail in Madison, Wisconsin, I naively asked, "What is a marshal? Is he like a deputy or something?" The marshal arrogantly replied, "Let me put it to you this way. I can go anywhere at any time and arrest anyone, including the President of the United States." I thought, man, what have I gotten myself into? Then I asked how they knew where I was. He said, "You guys make all the same stupid mistake. We know that if we really want you, all we have to do is hook up with your girl and she will lead us right to you." I learned very quickly that Donna's tears were about when I told her that I was on my way to greatness. She knew otherwise. She knew I was on my way to jail. And not only that, she knew that all the while she was working with the feds to catch me. Something else I found out, speaking of God's intervention, was that if the police would have caught up with me 10 miles later, I would have ended up going to jail in a county of Wisconsin that is run by the Ku Klux Klan. So here I am, Mom, 10 years for a bank robbery that I salvaged only $1,000 out of. That's $100 a year, less than 30 cents a day. Now that's crazy. All my love, your number one son.
It's no secret that my son is one man among the enormous number of Black men in the prison system. I'm incredibly grateful that he has managed to make it past the difficulties that made him vulnerable to the way of life that landed him there. The scars may never be completely healed, but when he tells me now of the young men and women that he is counseling through Bible study and the songs he composes, and when I see how hard he has worked to make peace with his wife and daughter for the years they spent without him, and now when I see the pride he has in his granddaughter, I can't help feeling proud of him and very, very relieved. So in a little bit, Zenzele is going to respond to this piece that we just read together, and we'll discuss whatever question she has. But first, Naja is going to read a small section from another chapter, which is titled Tanya's Birthday.
It's on page 35. It's the second to last paragraph. That's what I'll be starting. It is hard to immunize ourselves against the racism America was built on. Looking back, I can see how the self-hatred of internalized racism played out in many ways in our home. It wasn't unusual to hear Barney say something about someone who can't talk during dinnertime conversations, referring to someone they had seen at a party or a Black person on television whose speech patterns or dialect showed that they were not well educated. Nor was it unusual for Mama to say something about families who lived in the projects. Conversations that focused on skin color were not rare. I remember an incident at Mama's beauty shop when I was about 12 years old. Beauty and barbershops have always been places where folks in the Black community gather to relax and let their hair down, literally and figuratively. Typical of 1950s beauty salons, Mama's shop smelled like chemicals and old grease and sparkled with the sounds of laughter, hand clapping, and clicking curling irons. That day I flopped into the chair, dreading the familiar operation that I knew was coming when Mama dressed in her crisp white uniform that hairdressers wore back then, wrapped in a plastic cape around my shoulders and tied it behind my neck. Then she picked up a straightening comb and placed it in the stove that heated her straightening combs and curling irons. Mrs. King, a large woman who was always there to spread the latest gossip, said, "Yeah, girl, she should have known better, black as that nigga is." Mama pried the bright red top off of a black and white can with Madame Belva's hair wrap printed across the front in large letters, its name promising to fix hair that was somehow bad and in need of repair. In went 2 fingers, then out they came, carrying a blob of thick grease. She smoothed it into my hair section by section to make it easier for the hot comb to slide through the sizzling grease from the roots to the end of my hair, making it straight as a stick. Just as she turned the chair around so I was facing the mirror, Mrs. King said, "Got them red eyes too. You know he got to be the devil, or got to be evil, but she black too, so I guess they understand each other." Laughter exploded all around me, everyone in the shop, the other hairdressers, their clients, and the other women who, like Miss King, were just there to pass time away, howled as though it was the funniest thing they had ever heard. I looked at the reflections of myself and my mother standing behind me, and Mrs. King, whose wide hips drooped over the seat of her chair. Mama's skin and Mrs. King's reminded me of peaches, but mine is cinnamon brown. Compared to them and my sister Joanne, I felt black as coal. That glance in the mirror convinced me that I was fighting a losing battle just by being alive. It wouldn't matter how smart I was or how hard I tried. I would never be respected, neither by whites nor by my own people. You're muted, Celia.
Yeah. Then Naja is going to respond to that piece when we get to our conversation. And then Marquita was interested in the poem by Lucille Clifton that I begin the book with. So if you want to read that, Marquita, and then we'll just dive into our conversation.
It's at the very beginning of the book and on the page preceding the contents. Nobody mentioned slaves, and yet the curious tools shine with your fingerprints. Nobody mentioned slaves, but somebody did this work who had no guide, no stone, who molders under rock. Tell me your names. Tell me your bashful names, and I will testify.
Okay. So next, each of you is going to give a response and perhaps ask a question about the sections of the book that you read, or whatever you'd like to discuss regarding my book. Starting with Zenzele.
Okay, so I come to this book as a Black woman survivor of child rape, which occurred when I was 6 or 7 years old. I come to this book as a person who has spent a great part of my life in deep denial about how it impacted my relationships, career choices, and how I single parented my own daughters. I also come to this book as a 13-year-old who stole a car right off the lot with my neighborhood homies, but I didn't get caught. I come to this book as a person who has witnessed firsthand how the carceral state devastates families who have known no other way to cope with intraracial violence. And I also come from a family of women who've worked hard to dismantle stereotypes, sacrificing so much of their own happiness to create opportunities for new generations of Black women and girls like my daughters. I am proud to say that many of their sacrifices have paid off. Tell me your names and I will testify demonstrates the strength that we ignite when we make ourselves vulnerable and we allow others to move patiently and carefully through our personal and historical wounds. It's about learning to listen and respond to the yearning of our ancestors who did not have opportunities like the ones that Carolyn has created for up and coming generations of Black writers in the Twin Cities, people like myself. Carolyn illuminates the humanity of those who must live in the world that see us as some horrid stereotype: the addict, the criminal, the Black single mother with too many children on welfare, The 13-year-old girl has been raped by someone she thought loves her. But she also calls us to look back carefully on the legacies of our mothers and grandmothers and great-grandmothers, women who started their own beauty shops and created mini academies nestled in our public schools that persist to this very day. She shows us the love and care present in objectified spaces like alternative schools for teen parents and even juvenile detention centers in the middle of nowhere. She asks us to remember and to affirm those who are suffering and who are cast out. She teaches us not to judge and not to be ashamed. Tell Me Your Names and I Will Testify unpacks the meaning of trauma, disaggregating it from a shorthand term that we kind of use in community spaces. She asks us to investigate with acute specificity the hurt and the sadness and the shame that trauma, racial trauma, produces, and shows us by way of personal example, a pathway of living fully and creatively and honestly and fearlessly toward the deep wisdom that is gleaned when we lean in closely to our past in order to smash the shackles of anger, grief, and shame that will otherwise drown us in patterns of violence, hopelessness, and despair. Carolyn shows us another way, a better way to make peace with ourselves through making peace with our past. The other thing that I want to say is that Carolyn's writing is honest and tender and brave, touching on difficult topics like colorism, working and parenting as a Black woman in Minneapolis, and how to tap into love, not just self-love, but loving care and attentiveness to our children's wounds and curiosities, their wonders, and most importantly, to their pain. Through memoir, Carolyn teaches us how a daily practice of dedicating one's life and artistry to creating spaces of sharing through writing, listening, and creating offers us new understandings of resilience. So my question to Carolyn is, what were the tough decisions that needed to be made to come fully into your own life as a Black woman writer?
Okay. I would like to respond to everybody's questions, when we're done with this conversation, so I'm marking that down. And Naja, you can go ahead and respond and ask your question if you have one.
Yeah. So as I was reading the section that I just read, the first thing, just rereading it before I came onto this Zoom, you said you were 12 years old, and I relate to how colorism and jokes like that affected me at the same age. And I was just thinking like, wow, it's so crazy that we're multiple generations apart and had almost symmetrical experiences at the same age, being dark-skinned young Black girls.
Mm-hmm.
So I wanted to point that out. And, when I went to Ascension Catholic school, and I think that's where, at that time, from 9 to 14 age, is when it was implemented in me, where colorism really started affecting me. I always felt like the odd one out, especially because I had dreadlocks. I was the only girl who had dreadlocks. I was one of the darkest of the girls that I hung around. And I have a specific memory of me and my best friend at the time, who was a biracial girl. We were at recess, and I'm thinking it's probably around 5th or 6th grade, so probably 12, 13. And it's a specific memory I have where we were at recess and we were playing and whatnot. And all of a sudden we just start having a little shouting war, team light skin, team dark skin. And that's that was such a big thing, team light skin and team dark skin. And thinking back, I'm wow, colorism really created a barrier between me and loving myself, mm-hmm. as well as how I communicate and how I interact with other girls my age. Whether it was dark skin or light skin, I kind of had like envy towards other light skin. I would prejudge, like other light skinned girls my age just because of that mentality that was in my head, like that difference, And it was just the last paragraph. Let me quickly reread it. It was like that glance in the mirror convinced me that I was fighting a losing battle just by being alive. It wouldn't matter how smart or how hard I tried. I would never be respected, neither by whites nor by my own people. I thought that was really interesting, and made me propose the question in that moment, if you were to travel back into time, right at that moment, as yourself now, with all the knowledge and experience and wisdom that you have now, what would you say to your young self in that exact, when you looked in the mirror and said that?
Okay. Ooh, I don't know. These questions are big. Okay. Marquita, lay it on me.
Yeah. Well, I'll be brief because I can't wait to hear your answers either. I think that starting this work with the excerpt from the poem of Sister Clifton was a marvelous and profound way to open the reader to the necessity and value of telling our own stories, even the mundane ones, and such that by the end of your work, we are taken into the nuances and names of our own story. This is victory. This is why we read. And you've taken us there. In fact, your last line on your second chapter on page 26 says, and I learned that by coming clean myself, I had inspired students to find their own voice. That's victory. That is real victory. So my question would be, what was a seminal event in your life that you can point to as the one that brought you most fully into yourself?
Okay. All right. Let me try. I think what you said about the last line in my chapter called Coming Clean answers pretty much all of it. Tough decisions I had to make as a Black woman and a Black woman writer to tell these stories had to do with the things that I've lived with and the things that I see around me, the things that our people have struggled with for the last 401 years. And particularly Black women, even though the chapter that we read is about my Black son, who was raised by a Black woman. And where was I going with that? I really wanted, when I say, particularly Black women, I have 5 granddaughters, one who is transgender, and now I have 2 great-granddaughters, and not to mention my 3 daughters, who have all struggled with issues, with colorism, with all the things that have to do with being a Black woman. I'll never forget one day when my number 1 daughter, whose name is Iris, was coming home from somewhere. She was about 15 or 16, and some white dude tried to proposition her. White men driving into the neighborhood from their suburbs, propositioning Black women, and she didn't know what to do with that, because it was like, she's just trying to come home. That's all she was trying to do. And I mean, that's just one example of daily occurrences that happen. And I just really, and another thing is that, when my mother and I had a very fraught relationship during most of her life, but I will always be grateful that when she got sick and she had 5 years left, she and I were able to resolve so many things. And, but still, when she passed away, I was still left with unanswered questions. And I don't want my daughters or my sons or my granddaughters, my little granddaughters are too young. They don't, yeah. But I don't want these kids to have the questions that I have. I want them to be able to, come to me and ask questions. And this book is part of my response to what I think, you know, I want to share as a Black woman and a Black woman writer. Traveling back in time, what would I say to my young self? Looking back, that is such an interesting question. What would I say to myself? I have, you know, the more I learned about my mother's life, I think the more I understand why she might have remained silent while all these things were going on in her beauty salon. You know, she laughed with everybody else and she talked about people all the time. She was one of the worst gossips I ever met in my life, but she did not, you know, defend darker skinned people, including myself. And I think I understand a little bit better about, you know, where she was coming from. My mother became an orphan when she was 11 years old, and this is like back in the 30s or so. She and her siblings were like passed off to different people, and I have no idea of the horrible things that probably happened to my mother. I know a little bit, but I wanted to know more, and people in their generation just simply did not talk. And it was really hard to get answers. And so I imagined a lot of things. And I think I'm really talking around your question, Naja, because I'm not quite sure where to go with it. What would I tell myself? I would try to talk about, you know, some of the things I talk about in the last chapter of the book, which is called Stones and Sticks, about when this young white girl wanted to go roller skating through a graveyard. We went to Lakewood Cemetery, and she skated up to this statue that was all weather beaten and, you know, had black and brown stains all over it. And she took the group of poets to this statue and she said, "It's a Black woman. If you touch her, you'll die." It's like, oh my goodness. What do you do with that, you know? So I just sort of mull things over for a very long time. It was, I think I wrote that piece maybe 10, 15 years after it happened, because I just don't know what to do with things. I don't have quick responses. I wish I did. But Naja, I am just not quite sure how to respond to your question. I need to think about that. And Naja and I have these great conversations. And so, you know, when I figure it out, maybe we'll figure it out together. Maybe when I figure it out, I will. Yeah, that's something maybe we can write about together. I don't know. But I'm really sorry that that happened to you in middle school. But it also goes to show how big and how deep, you know, issues like colorism still are. And this is, oh, man. Yeah, so why don't the three of us just have a conversation before we open it up to the audience for questions? I don't know. I think I'd like to ask all of you now, and starting with you, Naja, now that you are 18, about to graduate from high school, looking back at that event now, what would you tell yourself?
What would I tell?
What would you tell your 12-year-old self?
I'd tell myself that's not the full story, you
What?
know, because I said I'd tell myself it's not the full story, because just how colorism affected like my mentality and going into different situations and dealing with different people. I always just had this story that like they're not gonna like you, you're not gonna be accepted, you're gonna be
Mhm.
the outsider. Like I think that for me that like that's where it started. It started with me, you know, in my mentality, and if I keep, you know, I kept having that, so that stuff actually happened. I didn't put myself out there. It's like, this is me. I'm secure with who I am. You know, I'm going to just go talk to this person and, no anxieties or anything. And I tell myself like to not come in with such a negative mindset, and I think that has affected me with so many things, including today, and like what I'm really working on now is just not coming in with so much heaviness on my mind about like what will happen.
Right.
Yeah. And I tell myself, like change is possible, and like to not let that control me so much, because it has so much control over me and how I view myself and how
Have you ever
love me and stuff. What'd you say?
Have you ever confronted that friend or had that conversation with her?
I haven't, no, because like after that year, like she left Ascension and we weren't really close at all after that. So I've never like rekindled with her really.
Okay, yeah. Oh my goodness. And yeah, your question, Zenzele, just based on everything that we've been talking about, what do you want to add? I mean, I was involved in a robbery as well of a gas station when I was about 16, 17 and ended up in juvie. We have so many issues we have to deal with. But what are your thoughts right now in this moment about what we're talking about?
Well, one of the things that occurred to me is just how important it is to be attentive. Because when I read your book, I just learned, like, there was one chapter, I think it was Tanya's birthday, that chapter,
Yeah.
where you were talking about mommy and me days and making time to spend time by yourself with that one daughter, and then just making it a point to just be kind of present and doing all the stuff that you were doing at the same time, which was kind of I mean, it's hard to imagine how you do so much and how you accomplish, like how you did all of that. But one of the things that drew me to that chapter was that I had a really tough relationship with my mother, but a lot of it had to do with my brother. And a lot of times it's hard for, thinking about Black mothers dealing with and being really close with a son, while at the same way holding them accountable for the harm that they have done to themselves and to others. And just kind of growing up and then just seeing like some of the differences between the way Black girls and Black boys are treated. And seeing, did you touch on these issues in the book and then explore them with your, I mean, because obviously Black feminism, we don't deal well with Black men. And I don't know if I like the inclusion. I mean, it's good that we talk about Black women, Black queer folks, but we still have to be able to talk really critically and tenderly, I think, about Black men, but also at the same time, while being aware at the ways in which some of their actions can harm us. And then so that's kind of what I thought about. And then in terms of colorism, like I grew up in the time of Beverly Johnson and Iman. And so these were perfectly, it's interesting because like this color, me facing a window gives me that type of skin color, but that's not my actual skin color. But we grew up like really segregated. I'm talking about within Black social spheres, by color. So the light ones, then you had the middle skin ones, and then you had folks who were darker skinned. And just how that like really, and then it goes into relationships, everything follows these whole patterns. And so it's just interesting how you talk about it in terms of, post-traumatic slave syndrome, but also dealing really explicitly with questions of shame and how we have to be able to work with and through that emotion in order to get to some level of healing. And so, I don't know, those are some of the things that I was thinking of. But I know my own daughters, lighter skinned daughter, darker skinned daughter, and then how this stuff the one who's darker skin is dealing much more with depression, anxiety. And then she was also at Naja's school, at De La Salle, and then how that impacts, her mental health. And then how I can sometimes be blind to like, oh, have you thought about this is actually it? But how do you deal with this, right? So I don't know, these are some of the things that were coming up for me.
Yeah, I think, at More Than a Single Story, the program that I have now, I think it was in the second or third year, I decided that we needed to deal with men. So I asked David Mira, who is not a Black man, he's a Japanese American man, but he and I sort of hold the same place in the literary communities of color. He's sort of the godfather. I'm kind of, people have called me their fairy godmother, it's a godmama, godpapa, whatever. And so he put together a group of men of color, Black and others, and just started having conversations about, what do men want to talk about publicly? I know what we as women want to hear, but we don't know what men want to talk about. And as it turns out, they did want to talk about toxic masculinity, which really surprised me. And then, when I think about homes, too many homes where the father is not present, it makes it really difficult because, as a woman, you don't know how to be a man, and therefore you don't know how to raise a man. And it's just, I don't know. I think we just have a lot of unnecessary, it does feel unnecessary pressure to me. That makes it really hard. And where there are homes where the father is present, I think the kids, the girls and the boys have a stronger self, view of themselves, although oftentimes the girls are still treated differently than the boys. Yeah, and that's a problem. And yeah, and the shame part, yeah, I mean, shame is just such a huge part, I think, of post-traumatic slave syndrome. Whereas, I mean, we put this stuff on ourselves, like Stevie put the fact that the store closed, the trucking company closed, it started to feel like it was his fault. Just like all the horrible things that happen to us are our fault, and they're not. But, there are things that have happened that we had no control over, and yet we shame ourselves, and we, have all of this, ugly feelings, or the ways that we treat each other, as you were talking about, with the different shades of color and all other kinds of reasons. Yeah, and so I just kind of wanted to touch on all of it the best I could in this book. Where are you at right now, Marquita? What are your thoughts? And
This has been a great conversation so far, and it's interesting that colorism certainly attracted my attention as well. It's a very profound question, and Naja raises, and I really appreciate and honor you for raising that question in this sphere, Naja, and it's certainly one I don't have an answer to in terms of my own life. So it is one that's worth thinking about. It's ironic in the sense that one of the things that I do at the Urban League is run this program called Black Gems, and it's a program for high schoolers, so college and career readiness type of program that focuses on SEL learning. So one of the things that I'm going to do next year with the program, is I've gotten clarity from talking to kids about what they need, is to teach white supremacy. And because I need for them to understand the origins of this, and as it relates to the US of A, and the origins of hierarchy back to Aristotle, and the whole beehive thing, and layers of hierarchy, where all that started. I need them to understand that so that they can stop blaming themselves, so Black folks can stop blaming themselves.
Yep.
So, because that tends to be our go-to. So even when it comes to colorism, we start blaming ourselves because we don't understand how this ideological construct has been formed and perpetuated over time. So it gives me this conversation validates for me that that is a necessary place to start, and that we have to grasp and take responsibility for our own learning.
Yeah.
Part of what I do in education for the League is to advocate, in certain spaces around that. And one of the things that I've come to conclude is that we cannot wait for the state to change their curriculum in social studies to be able to talk about ethnic studies and so forth and so on. Much of what you raise in your book is that ends up being themes vis-a-vis your experience, are things that we have to begin to teach ourselves about as we engage life. And so I'm excited about that. I think that a lot of what you've written, a lot of what I've heard this afternoon speaks to the need for that. And so I'm looking forward to that. I was shocked. I had a conversation with the kids a week or two ago and raised the question of colorism. And I was shocked that it was still a thing, because it was in my generation, but I'm thinking over time that it has become less of a thing. And to hear the kids talk about, oh yeah, and I mean, there isn't a high school you can go to and escape it, or a middle school, so it's not about place, it's everywhere, it's in our communities. It even lifts its head when you hear Black girls talk about Black boys only wanting to date white girls. It lifts its head in that way. And so it's still a problem that we have to make sure is not part of the way our identity has been racialized. We have to make sure of that. It's one thing to choose. I'm not against anybody's personal choice. You love who you love and all of that. It's another thing when it's part of your racialized identity to choose in certain ways. And that's what we want to make sure people are doing, that people are free to choose rather than feel like they have to choose in order to be validated in and of themselves. The thing that I think is really amazing about your story with your son, Carolyn, is, and this may be true for all your kids, for your parenting style, is that you let them be who they were. And that's a major thing when it comes to parenting, is allowing your kids to be whoever they are. And that's for me, that's an important takeaway. I raised boys. So I had to come to the let them be who they're going to be, moments, because they are boys, and that's the pushback is a little different from boys than it is from girls, as you may well imagine, because you raised both. I have 3 stepdaughters, but I didn't raise them. So I came into them, when they were mature. I came into their lives when they were mature, but nonetheless, I think that's a big takeaway from your work, is that you let that be. And I think you're better for it. It enabled you to maintain the relationship over time, much like I'm seeing it play out in my own life with my own boys. It enables us to maintain relationship over time. I am a widow now. And so they have to, they rely on me still for the nurturing because of the loss of their dad.
Sure.
But, and it's been a while. So it happened, at a key time in their life. They were college age. So it was a key time in their life. But my late husband certainly left other male figures that were go-tos for them, that were for his friends. And so therefore they had the same kind of, ideological frame and that kind of thing. Nonetheless, it's hard for, Black male children in this arena. And it's hard for what is now, for me, single women to raise them in this context. And you've outlined it with all of its ups and downs very well. And that gives us, reading your story allows me to exhale about my own.
Yeah. Yeah, my parents were very, very strict, and you know how we all grew up and say, I'm not going to be like my mom. I'm going to be different. You know, that's one thing that I decided I was going to do, to let my children be who they are, and they can talk to me about anything. And Lord, some of the things they talk about, I think, oh my God, I want to hear that.
Exactly.
You know, but it's a vow I made to myself, so I listen and I cringe. So do you guys want to respond to anything each other said before we open it up to the audience?
Just how Zenzele and Grandma, you were talking about shame, and I didn't even like really think about it until you guys brought that up, and how like how you were talking about like learning about white supremacy and stuff. Because when I was young, and you know, I had all these like just different negative mentalities, it would all boil down to like myself, you know, like I would always put it on myself, you know. And I had so much inward shame and hate and doubt just towards myself, and I didn't even realize like how that affected me too, you know, and how everything that would happen, it would just, I was always blaming myself, you know. So thank you guys for bringing that up, because it gives me something to feel about now. Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, shame is big and it's pervasive. It's different from guilt. You can do something and feel guilty and bad about it, and it's done. But shame is just there. It's just, it's how you described it.
Overwhelming.
I feel like I'm a much better writer than I am a talker. I'm sorry that I just kind of get lost in my verbal words. But anything else anyone wants to say before I know Clarence wants to open it up.
Yeah, I would just say, like, it's important what Marquita said about really linking it back to white supremacy and these ideologies of white supremacy, but doing so in a way that we can see how our own emotional lives are impacted by white supremacy, and begin to think about it in that way. So it's not just blaming the mom or blaming the dad or blaming whoever, but looking at the structures.
At the big structure.
That's exactly right. You know, we have to look at that system as well, because this is all intentional. It's by design. You know, it's not happenstance, it's by design. And we need to be aware of that. And I think if you grow with that understanding, if you can do it as a teenager, if you can get that as a teenager, you will embrace the world differently.
Right.
So it's really about just taking the time to do that. And I really do think that that's going to be a key part of how we approach building confidence and all of the other soft skills that one associates with social emotional learning. I think that's the key to success. I think that's what comes across in your writing, Carolyn, is one of the, I can't remember which chapter it is. I took note of it somewhere, but at the end of the chapter, at the end of chapter 14, I wrote the word unbowed, exclamation point. Because that's who you were, as you know, as all of whatever, you were never your situation. And so, and at the end of 14, I just wrote the words unbowed in quotes and exclamation point. I mean, that is just powerful right there. And if we can get, and I don't think that just happened. You know, that wasn't a fluke. And so I think that was very deliberate. And I think we can extract some things and be able to use it to benefit kids coming up, or I shouldn't say kids, the young people coming up. Naja is lucky to know
starting as little kids, because they're marked the minute they're born.
That's
and
right.
Yeah. So I'm working on a novel now that sort of, I hope, goes deep into that DNA that we have inherited of both shame and resilience. So here's some stuff coming up really good. Clarence, I'm sorry, I think it looks like you wanted to open it up, so go ahead. There's stuff coming in the chat now.
It's all good. We have a few questions. Just one of the things I thought was really remarkable, you know, you've talked about the More Than a Single Story series, and that you started out with several sessions with Black women, which were brilliant.
Yep.
I mean, just, they were, I think, one of the most astute commentaries on society and culture that has been collected for a while. But I know, I remember you gathering a bunch of men together, and I remember sitting around a table with a lot of BIPOC fathers. And like Marquita was talking about, letting the kids be who they are and how important that is. And, sort of, it does that on a personal level for any individual, but also especially for Black kids or Black parents, because I looked around that table and other people of color and Indigenous people, all of those fathers were people, and I thought, goodness, all of these people, except for my dad, these are my favorite fathers. My dad's my favorite father, who I lost just recently, but I looked at the table and it's like all of those guys, they were doing great stuff, but none of them was doing this fatherhood out of a pattern. We were all doing something very different than what was prescribed for us as society's idea of a father, and even, what our fathers tried. So, I mean, I just think that's so important. And then also having conversations about the intersection of racism and sexism and patriarchy and racialized society, and how patriarchy is just a huge tool of pushing the racist agenda. So I appreciate that. But
I forgot you were there at that table, and you were on the very first public male panel we had too.
And I appreciated having David there. But why don't I see we have some questions. If anyone wants to put a question in chat, go ahead, do that. Maybe we will have some other verbalized questions as well. But I wanted Arlita drop something in the chat, and I'll just read it off here. It says, Carolyn, even for the many years that I've known you, I so appreciate learning more about you and your work. Thank you. Coming clean is my favorite. And maybe, I mean, you guys talked about that concept as well, and maybe you want to elaborate on that. I wonder, after dedicating so much of yourself and your life to encouraging people, the sharing, sharing of stories, how you and the other panelists think of telling, sharing stories as a liberating practice.
Liberation practice. Well, Arlita, I mean, that's all I do is working toward that. The organizations that I have created, Sassy and More Than a Single Story, are for that purpose, is to get people to talk to each other and to participate in their own thinking about liberating themselves and the people they love and the people that they don't love even. The writing workshops that I teach on trauma and other things are, I mean, it's all, that's what I have in mind, is liberating ourselves and, working toward liberation. What about the rest of you? How would you respond to our latest question?
I think that at least for me, and we're in the same generation. In my experience, I didn't grow up with the notion of telling your story. That was always thought of as your personal business. You don't put the family business out there.
That's right.
You keep secrets, all of that. That's the context in which I grew up. And so to be someone who tells their story is something I had to grow into. And I'm still growing into, because I'm not always sure that the value of, I'm not always sure of the value of it. Because people, and so because so I have mixed feelings about it. I think it can lead to your own liberation. Certainly, it can be part of the liberation struggle. Certainly, I think as long as your story is used to empower others, to inform others, then it works. when people try to listen for your story to use it against you, you have to be aware that that's a risk that you take when you tell your story. And so because that's a risk, you have to be comfortable in your own skin to be able to tell that part of your story. Otherwise, it has the possibility of unnerving you. So I'm not trying to, it's a broad question. So I'm not trying to say that everybody should rush out and do that. I'm saying that in order to do that, you have to have a certain level of sure-footed about who you are and your story and whatnot. So I wouldn't, for example, advise my, young folks to go out and, tell all of whatever. I just wouldn't, because they don't have the maturity to be able to handle what people do with it. And so that would be my caution. I own it. That's personal. That's part of my story and part of my own growth process. But as an individual, I'm good with sharing my story because I think it's a point of authenticity. I think it makes whatever else I'm going to be talking about, whatever I'm going to be advocating about, authentic. So that would be my 2 cents on the subject.
I am not all that comfortable in my skin. For me, it's more of a thing that I was driven to do. When this ancestor showed up at my front door and told me to tell our stories, I didn't want her coming back. I thought I did this thing. And then, working with young people, I think it's encouraging for them to hear that life wasn't perfect for us.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
So, yeah, that's just my thought.
Yeah.
What about you, Zenzele?
Well, it's an interesting question. And I think that when we talk about storytelling and personal storytelling, it's important to be really distinctive, because I think when we talk about storytelling, it's not a way to reify the self for one's own victimization. When we tell stories, particularly out of a Black feminist tradition, it's really to enhance our collective liberation, or the possibilities of our collective liberation. And so, so when I say, yeah, I sold the car when I was 13 years old. Like, we didn't get comfortable. I was like, it's because a lot of us have done that. And a lot of us have just simply have been lucky enough not to get caught up in the system. But if I had got caught, then it would have been a whole cycle. And me making that decision didn't have to do with just me. It had to do with a whole range of circumstances: isolation, loneliness, despair, abandonment. Those are the sorts of things that lead to kind of crazy decision-making. And this I shouldn't call it crazy, I don't want to offend nobody, but irrational decision-making, meaning if you had a chance to think about it, you might have made a different decision to enhance, your own well-being. So when I think about our leader's question about liberation, a lot of times we think about liberation, we talk about breaking the chains and revolutions, or something else like that. But when I hear the word liberation, particularly in relation to storytelling, I think about it as creating spaces to make it possible for us to make decisions to be free. Because a lot of times when we're afraid, when we're anxious, we make decisions that basically entrap us, that keep us within these cycles. And I'll be the first one to say, for Black women especially, we have to stop being the mules of the earth. That means we have to stop carrying our trauma and holding it in. Because once we share it, it's no longer just ours. The community has to hold it. So then we're lighter. We have more possibilities to be free because we have more spiritual space, heart space, mental space. So that we're not carrying all that in our bodies, in our minds, and our spirits. So that's kind of what I thought about with that really kind of provocative question, Arlita.
And it gives other Black women, it gives us permission to hold each other and to come out with these stories and to lighten our own burdens. What would you say, Naja? How would you respond to our leader's question?
I agree with what all of you guys are saying, especially Zenzele, because it is heavy, you know, like holding on to stuff that's traumatizing. It's heavy, and I feel like it's just when you lift that off, that's the first step to healing, you know, because if, and a lot of the problem is, I think also is because a lot of people don't know like what they're holding on to is so heavy. They don't even realize how impactful that is to them, you know? So yeah, I
listen to
definitely,
my little 18-year-old brilliant child here.
Yep.
Keep going. I'm sorry. I just got proud of you for a moment
you're
there.
good. That storytelling and sharing our individual stories it heals us, and it makes us stronger.
Yep.
And it makes us vulnerable too. You know, I know I for one struggle with being vulnerable. But being vulnerable is being powerful. So yeah.
And that's one thing that's been sort of hidden from Black women. You know, the myth of the strong Black woman is something I absolutely despise because of the negative effect it has on us. It does not allow us to be our authentic selves. It doesn't allow us to feel the pain and to be able to cry and all of the things that we need to do in order to heal. So, you know, whoever still believes in the strong Black woman, don't you ever let me hear you say that phrase. I will hurt you. And I hope you see I'm not smiling. Well, I wasn't.
Thanks. Maybe we can get to another question here if everyone is ready for that. There's a question. I recently participated in a discussion that included Amy Meredith Cox, where she presented on her recent project, Cosmic Cartographies. Cartographies. The thrust of her scholarship addresses how race, racism, Blackness, love, healing, protection, and notions of care in and for Black women manifest in our bodies. How do you think about movement and how movement and writing operate as strategies for healing? How are these ideas of mapping pain and love and healing, how do they assist future generations? And finally, who is the book for, and who do we move with and for with this practice?
Oh, I love that question. Yes, movement. Movement is so, I mean, Zenzele, I would like for you to go with that one first, because you do practice all of it.
I do some. I just want to say thanks for the shout out to Amy Meredith Cox. She's like a contemporary. She does really amazing work, ethnographic work, and she was a former dancer, and she worked with just an incredible kind of scholar and creative and yoga teacher. But I think the first thing we have to do is decolonize our movements. Even when we show up in spaces like yoga spaces and everything, we're taught to like be in a box, like literally these Zoom boxes. When we go into the classroom, you sit at your desk, you sit in this little box. We're so used to being in cells, but we have a spiral, right? The universe is a spiral. It's not a flat two-dimensional thing. And so a lot of times our spatial practices are very two-dimensional. They're straight and forward, back and forth. Everything has to be perfect, but we need to be able to move and to dance and allow ourselves to be able to dance with each other, right? To be able to work through that. And I think that, you know, in terms of the question about a healing practice and through writing, I mean, those are just really profound questions. Mapping pain and love and healing. I think writing provides the opportunity to do that mapping, I would say, to be brief. Journaling. I realized I had such a colonized relationship with my journal. I found my journal from the 5th grade. No, excuse me, from the 3rd or 4th grade. And it was all about, dear diary, I like this boy, dear diary, dear diary. That's like colonized thinking. And it's like, it wasn't until like, at some point much later that I realized that my thought processes, I wasn't allowing the full of my emotional self to get down on the page because of how I thought I should be relating to just the writing. So I think decolonization as a practice is important, and getting out of these two-dimensional presentations of self and creative writing and thinking and memory and time. So that's what I'll say to let other folks jump in.
Yeah, that such a beautiful question, Earl. And I do teach journaling workshops as well for that very reason, to help get people outside of the box of the journal, of thinking about your journal, because it can be such a healing space. I like to think of it as your own private playground. It is yours. And offering techniques to help you continue to make it yours. And when we have our pre-meetings for more than a single story discussions, I always tell people, if something starts to trigger you during a conversation, or even in my classes too, get up and move your body, because it really does there's something that's just really healing and powerful and amazing about just moving your body, even in small ways. Sometimes just yawning can release some pent up stuff, Anybody else want to respond to that?
I want to say that I think that talking about writing and moving our bodies, doing like yoga and dancing and whatnot, I think that it allows us to release our emotions, and a lot of us, I think even people who are like highly emotional and express their emotion, they still, to a point, we still like keep some things just pent up in us.
Yep.
And I think that writing, especially for me, like I'm just beginning, I've done journaling off and on, but I'm starting to get back into it. But just like letting it all out, on the paper, it's a release, especially for me, like all my pent up emotions, it's just a release. And dancing and listening to music is kind of a release of emotion and pent up energy that's stuck.
Yep.
Those are my 2 cents.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks everyone. We're getting close to our planned time to the end. I know there are a couple more ideas in the chat. Maybe one real quick, anyone can respond to, but Earl was also asking, I'm thinking about Eloise Greenfield's book, Honey, I Love, and the importance of children's books. And as a writer, how have children's books and poems played a role in creating healing?
Oh, that's nice. But I would like, since we're so close to the end, I'm wondering if anyone else who's in the audience has a question or a comment before we hang up.
Yeah.
And Earl, we'll get to you. I just want to make sure that Phyllis or Joyce or Allison or Sandy or Peter,
Don't be shy.
Tom or Tina have anything that you wanted to contribute. Sandy, okay.
Yes. I'm going to do my old man glasses thing here and get a little help. She says, I'm blown away by the community knowledge. Could you, let's see.
Are you asking for suggestion of books just to stay in this conversation, or what do you mean? I've jotted down the one suggested here. Thank you. And Carolyn, I know you like provide. Yeah, I do provide. After a more than a single story discussion, we have started providing a list of resources. So on our website, which is, I'm just going to put our website in the chat here.
Good.
And let's see. We also have a monthly newsletter now about things that are coming up. We have a conversation coming up in a few weeks on how on financial trauma in the communities of color. It's one that keeps coming back. People keep asking for it.
When is this one? I need to get on that.
It's on April 28th.
Okay.
The Ramsey County Library is co-sponsoring that one. But But yeah, when we think about post-traumatic slave syndrome and we think about all the ways that our communities have been traumatized, a lot of times we don't think about the way that it affects our finances, our ability, or affects us around the issue of finances. And it's huge. It's amazing. It's huge. So that one's coming up. And then we have one coming up on May 13th on just based kind of on Toni Morrison's The Bluest Eye, and how beauty standards affect women in the communities of color. That one will be led by Naja's mother and one of her partners in the beauty industry. And it's just gonna, wow. I'm always amazed at the things that come up with these things. Anyway, final response to Earl's question. Had to do with
the children's books and healing.
I would just say that, you know, kind of in combination to the two questions, that the book, children's books are, you know, really pivotal in creating the outlook that you want kids to grow with. And books with Black authors were our mainstay, you know, raising the boys. And I say that because I'm reminded of a conversation I had with my youngest son, who's in his late 20s, and a lesson that he was dealing with in his adult life. He's in grad school now. He referenced one of Julius Lester's books as the initial time when he learned that lesson. And that was, and so that validated for me the necessity of being deliberate in what you read to your kids as they're growing up, even in preschool years, and they will never forget them. Black folks have a way of telling the story, even in children's books, that's profound and memorable. And even when you think, you know, it's late at night and you don't know how much they're retaining or whatever, this is something that's, I don't know, 25 years later that this kid is remembering. So it does have a place in the liberation ideology that we like to raise our kids with. And so I'm a strong advocate for Black writers in children's books. We relied a lot on Julius Lester's books growing up, and, you know, some of the Aesop's fables and, you know, different things, Mephado's Beautiful Daughters, and, you know, all of those that, you know, you read about now. I really do encourage folks to invest in them, and it is an investment. They're not cheap, but it's well worth the investment. Read them over and over again.
And there's so many new ones coming out all the time too.
Yes.
Children's writers of color are making their voices heard. And Earl just said something about Jan Mandel. I'm a big fan of Jan's. Glad that they have a book coming out. That's really awesome. From Hurt to Healing.
Yeah, actually, that was Peter.
Okay.
Yes.
Oh, I'm sorry, Peter.
Yeah.
That's Peter.
Yeah. So on Friday, the April 23rd, that will be happening.
That'll be here at the ESFL.
Peter,
are you there? Peter.
go ahead.
Yes, it will be here at 5:30 in the afternoon. A number of the kids who are active with the Irreducible Grace Foundation and a number of the elders who participated in sharing their stories for the book.
Wow.
We have sold 1,000 copies of the book before it has even officially gone on the market.
Wow.
Organizations are snapping up massive copies to use hands-on with activities. So we're thrilled, and it seems like such a great follow-up to the conversation that you all have been sharing with us today.
Wonderful. Oh, good. Yeah.
Yeah. So That hasn't been posted on our events calendar yet, but I put in the link to our calendar and it should be showing up there pretty soon, along with many other events as well. Even in the pandemic, we were quite busy and there are a lot of conversations to have.
Yep.
So, definitely appreciate that. I know people need to go. This has been a wonderful conversation, another valuable conversation. So thank you, Carolyn Holbrook, for once again creating some great dialogue, some things to make us think in a way that sustains us, regenerates us, and changes the narrative so that it isn't one that weighs us down and you know, we're bringing our voices to the table. So I appreciate that. So again, thank you very much. Peter, do you know where Carolyn's or Jan's book can be found, or when it's available again?
There will be copies at Subtext, but there is a website for the Irreducible Grace Foundation. You can order the books directly from them.
Okay, great, thank you.
Great.
And
So-
I just want to, I'm sorry.
Go ahead, yes.
I just want to thank my conversation partners, the term that I borrowed from Krista Tippett, you know, for doing this thing with me today, and all of you who showed up in the audience. Thank you so much for being here. And Peter
Thank you.
and Clarence, wow, this is great. Thank you.
All right.
Thank you all very much. It's
All
been
right,
my
y'all take care.
Thank
All
you.
right,
Naja, I look forward to seeing a lot more of you in the years ahead.
Yes.
Yes,
well, she's
Nadia.
pretty amazing.
Yes.
Yes, she is.
She's pretty amazing.
Yes.
So proud of my youngins.
Yes.
All right. All right.
Well, everybody.
Thank you
All
all.
right. Take good care.
Bye-bye.